Everything about the 71B bus route was ordinary, at least until you considered the tales circulating among late-night commuters. According to the whispers around town, anyone who caught the last bus at midnight might encounter far more than a simple ride home. Rosalie never believed such rumors. She considered herself practical, guided by logic, not superstition. Yet, on a chilly autumn night, she found herself stuck at the terminal past her usual hour, forced to board that final bus home. She was a teaching assistant at a local community college. Grading papers in her small, fluorescent-lit office had consumed her evening, causing her to miss her usual 10 p.m. ride. By the time she reached the terminal, the only bus left to her neighborhood was the 71B, scheduled to depart exactly at midnight. Her watch read 11:53 p.m., giving her just enough time to rush through the deserted station. The bus itself was half-lit, the overhead bulbs flickering in and out. A lone driver with tired eyes met her at the door. His name tag read, Cliff. He barely acknowledged Rosalie, only offering a distracted grunt as she swiped her pass and took a seat near the middle. She noticed only 4 other passengers: a woman in a red coat reading a battered paperback, an older man with a cane staring out the window, and a pair of college students whispering conspiratorially to each other. The air inside the vehicle felt stale, carrying the faint odor of gasoline and wet pavement. Right at midnight, the engine roared to life. Cliff pulled out of the terminal with surprising speed, almost as if he was eager to get the journey over with. Rosalie glanced at her phone. No signal. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was a glitch, but an uneasy tension tugged at her, a feeling that something was off about this ride. The bus rolled through darkened streets, past closed shops and silent houses. Initially, nothing seemed unusual. Every so often, streetlights illuminated the windows, casting fleeting glows on the passengers' faces. Rosalie tried to distract herself by looking out the window. She saw her reflection staring back at her, dark circles under her eyes. Then she caught a glimpse of something behind her. A shape, maybe a silhouette, flickering in the reflection. Turning around quickly, she expected to see a new passenger, but the seats behind her were empty. She chalked it up to fatigue and returned her gaze to the roads outside, only to find the reflection had changed. The shape was closer, impossibly so, though there was no physical sign of it in the bus. Nervous goosebumps crept along her arms. About 15 minutes into the journey, the bus pulled to a stop. The front doors hissed open. Normally, if no one was there to board or exit, the driver would keep going. But this time, Cliff kept the doors open, staring into the darkness. The older man with the cane seemed perturbed and tapped his foot in impatience. After a long minute, Cliff shut the doors and continued driving without a word. They passed a deserted park, the lamps casting pale halos in the fog. Rosalie felt the bus slowing again. This time, the woman in the red coat rose to exit, but when she reached the doors, Cliff abruptly accelerated, nearly throwing her off balance. "Hey!" the woman shouted, but he didn't respond. She pulled the cord, ringing the bell again. Still, Cliff kept driving as though he hadn't heard. Rosalie watched the woman's frustration build until she finally retreated to her seat, angry and unsettled. Unease rippled through the passengers. One of the college students, a young man in a hoodie, walked up the aisle to confront Cliff. Rosalie couldn't hear the exact words exchanged, but she saw the driver's face in the mirror, haunted, almost blank, like he was lost in a trance. A few tense moments passed before the student hurried back to his seat, muttering to his friend, "He's not listening. Like he can't even see me." With each passing block, the bus's environment grew more unnerving. The overhead lights flickered more violently. The hum of the engine took on a droning note that buzzed in Rosalie's ears. She felt as though they were no longer traveling through the familiar city streets. The window views became disconcerting. Identical rows of dark houses, the same flickering lamppost repeating at intervals, as if the bus were driving through a loop in time. Suddenly, the older man with the cane stood up, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stop this bus right now," he demanded. His voice trembled, not from age but from fear. He slammed the cane against the handrail near the driver. Cliff didn't flinch. The bus continued at a steady pace, the world outside increasingly unrecognizable. The older man shouted again, this time turning to the passengers. "He's not stopping. "Does anyone have a phone that works?" Rosalie checked hers. No signal. The woman in the red coat shook her head, and the college students both stared helplessly at their darkened screens. Panic spread in the cramped space. The overhead lights blinked once more, then died completely. They were cast into near total darkness, save for the occasional glow from the passing streetlights, or whatever stood in for streetlights in this labyrinth of a route. In that flickering semi-darkness, Rosalie saw a horrifying sight. Reflected in the windshield's faint glare was a gaunt figure standing behind Cliff's seat. It wore something reminiscent of a tattered conductor's uniform, eyes sunken, mouth parted in a silent scream. The figure lifted a skeletal hand and placed it on Cliff's shoulder, as though guiding him. Rosalie's throat went dry. She found herself unable to speak or even move. The bus began to pick up speed. The engine roared louder, vibrating the seats. Outside, the road seemed to swirl in a black void. The cityscape gone. A claustrophobic dread seized each passenger as they realized there was no sign of the normal world. The older man dropped his cane and stumbled backward. The woman in red clung to her seat, knuckles white. The college students held each other, eyes wide with terror. Rosalie forced herself to stand, struggling to keep her balance as the bus jerked left and right. She made her way to Cliff, ignoring the twisted specter behind him. Gasping for courage, she grabbed the wheel. "Stop!" she screamed. Cliff's hands felt ice-cold beneath hers, and for a second, she thought she glimpsed raw fear in his eyes. Fear that matched her own. Summoning every ounce of will, Rosalie yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. A high-pitched squeal tore through the air as the bus careened, slamming into something unseen. Passengers were thrown from their seats. Rosalie heard screams mingled with the rending of metal. Her vision blurred. Everything went black. When she came to, Rosalie was lying on the ground outside the bus. She could hear distant sirens and see red and blue lights flashing against the night sky. Disoriented, she sat up to find paramedics rushing around. The 71B lay on its side, windows shattered. There were no signs of the other passengers or even a driver, just an empty bus. A paramedic hurried over, checking her for injuries. Rosalie's mind spun. "Where is everyone?" she croaked. The paramedic glanced at her with a puzzled expression, explaining that the bus was empty when they arrived, except for her. No bodies. No sign that anyone else had been on board. Rosalie tried to protest, but her words caught in her throat. As she was lifted onto a gurney, her gaze drifted to the battered side of the bus. Through one fractured window, she swore she saw the pale figure in the ragged conductor's uniform. Its lifeless eyes stared back. In a blink, it was gone. For weeks, she remained in recovery, haunted by nightmares of that midnight ride. The official report blamed driver error. Yet, to this day, whispers persist that the last bus on the 71B route doesn't always bring passengers home. Some say it travels into a realm beyond comprehension, guided by an otherworldly presence that claims lost souls in the dead of night. And if you ever find yourself at the terminal after hours, you might spot the battered bus pulling in, its headlights flickering like a dying heartbeat, board at your own peril. The Thornbury Bridge had stood for nearly a century over the slow-moving waters of Slate Creek. Few people paid it any mind during the day. It was just a rusty structure with chipped paint, overgrown weeds sprouting from the cracks in the pavement. But after sunset, rumors swirled about a malevolent presence lurking underneath. Locals called it the Crawling Woman, an urban legend passed down by generations of teens who dared each other to see if the stories were true. Gabriel was new to town, having moved from a bustling city to the sleepy outskirts of Thornbury for a more peaceful life. He hadn't heard of the Crawling Woman until one evening when he found himself at a bonfire with co-workers. In a bid to scare him, one of them recounted the legend. A young woman, fleeing a terrible home situation, had once tried to cross the Thornbury Bridge at night. She never made it to the other side. Some say she was attacked and thrown over, her body caught in the shallow creek. Others insist she jumped, a final desperate act. Either way, her restless spirit was said to roam under the bridge, dragging herself through the mud, waiting to pull unsuspecting people into the water. Gabriel, skeptical, brushed off the tale. Yet, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the dread he saw on the face of his coworkers who swore they'd seen glowing eyes under the bridge. After the bonfire ended, he drove home, passing that very bridge. His heart pounded a little faster as his headlights illuminated the sagging metal beams. Nothing happened, of course, but he felt a cold shiver run through him. A few weeks later, Gabriel found himself working late. By the time he left the office, the moon hung low in the sky, and the streets were empty. The shortest route home was over Thornbury Bridge. He tried to dismiss the creeping anxiety in his chest. It's just a story, he told himself. Yet, as he approached, the wind seemed to carry a faint sound, like scraping or shuffling coming from beneath the structure. His curiosity won out. Pulling over, he decided to take a quick look. The night air was crisp, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows on the concrete. Gabriel peered over the side of the bridge, seeing only the dark shape of the creek below. Then he heard it again, a soft scraping noise. Carefully, he climbed down the embankment. The underbelly of the bridge was a tangled mess of graffiti, rusted beams, and scattered debris. A trickle of water ran through the mud, reflecting tiny glints of moonlight. That's when he saw something move. At first, he thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat. But the shape was too large, too contorted. His heart rate spiked. Fighting every instinct to flee, he took a few more steps forward, flashlight in hand. The beam landed on a figure sprawled near the water's edge, dressed in a white gown darkened by grime. Long, wet hair clung to a pale face. Two luminous eyes snapped up to meet his gaze, and the figure began to drag itself closer, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Gabriel gasped, stumbling backward. The woman let out a guttural moan, each movement accompanied by the sickening scrape of bone against concrete. She was fast despite her twisted limbs, each lurch covering more ground than should be possible. Gabriel turned and bolted up the slope, heart hammering. As he reached the top, a cold hand seized his ankle, and he screamed. Adrenaline surging, he kicked free, racing to his car. Once inside, he locked the doors and started the engine. His headlights illuminated the embankment. For a split second, he saw the woman perched there, head tilted, staring at him with those glowing eyes. Then, with a sudden jerk, she scrambled out of sight. Gabriel floored the accelerator, not daring to look back until he was safely past the bridge. The next day, he debated telling someone, maybe the authorities. But would they believe him? He could barely believe it himself. Instead, he returned to his routine, trying to push the encounter from his mind. Yet at night, he dreamed of the woman's contorted figure, of her eyes locking onto his. Sleep became elusive, broken by nightmares that left him drenched in sweat. A week later, news broke of a missing teenager last seen in the vicinity of Thornbury Bridge. Rumors flew through the community. The crawling woman got them, some whispered. Others blamed real-world crimes or accidents. Gabriel felt guilt gnaw at him. Perhaps if he'd spoken up, the teen would have been warned. But still, who would believe a story so grotesque? Determined, he mustered the courage to investigate the bridge one more time, this time armed with a camera, a powerful flashlight, and a friend named Dina, who was equally intrigued by the paranormal. At dusk, they approached the silent structure. Dina's hands shook, but she insisted on filming for proof. The scene under the bridge was as dismal as before. Water dripped from the rusted beams, creating a steady tap-tap that echoed in the cramped space. They scanned the area for signs of the woman. Minutes passed, and all they captured was graffiti and dark water. Just as they considered leaving, Dina gasped. She pointed to the far corner where the water pooled in a deeper basin. A pale shape lay half submerged. Cautiously, they approached. The shape was indeed a figure, a drowned man's body, bloated from days in the water. Dina nearly retched, and Gabriel struggled to keep the camera steady. They called the police at once, hearts pounding with a mixture of horror and relief. This wasn't the woman, but another victim. Or so they thought. The sun had fully set by the time police arrived. Red and blue lights flashed across the underside of the bridge. An officer asked them to stay back, while another waded into the shallow water to examine the body. Suddenly, that same scraping noise echoed through the air. Everyone froze. Out of the shadows crawled the figure from Gabriel's nightmares, her white gown dripping, hair tangled. The officer yelled commands, but she lunged with startling speed, letting out a wail that pierced the night. Panic ensued. The officers stumbled back, struggling to draw their weapons in the confined space. Dina screamed, dropping the phone. Gabriel grabbed her arm, pulling her away. In the chaos, they lost sight of the creature, but heard splashing as she vanished into the water's darkness. By the time the team regained composure, there was no trace of her but muddy handprints along the concrete. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueling the legend further. Official reports cited an unknown vagrant, or wild animal, but the shaken officers privately conceded it was unlike anything they had seen. The discovery of the drowned man's body only added to the aura of dread. Gabriel and Dina moved away from Thornbury soon after. Neither could handle the sleepless nights and the ceaseless rumors. Yet the story of the crawling woman persists. Locals still warn newcomers, don't go under the Thornbury Bridge after dark. They say you can hear her nails scraping the concrete, searching for the next soul to drag into the cold water. Some claim to see her reflection if they dare to look over the railing, but be warned, if she sees you first, you might never leave the creek's muddy bank again. Every February, the small town of Rosemoor transformed into a picturesque haven of romance. Flower stands and heart-shaped decorations adorned the quaint streets. But hidden behind the charming storefronts and festive atmosphere lay an urban legend as old as the town itself. The Vanishing Valentine. They said that if you walked through Crestwood Cemetery on Valentine's night, you might spot a mysterious, veiled figure kneeling by a grave of faded roses. If you dared approach, she'd turn to you with hollow eyes and offer a single flower. Legend insisted that if you accepted the flower, you'd vanish before morning, never to be seen again. Marion, a local florist, had heard the legend every year. Despite the creepy undertones, she found it more sad than frightening, a tale of lost love and heartbreak. Business was booming at her shop as Valentine's Day approached. Rows of red roses, pink lilies, and baby's breath crowded the counters. Young couples giggled as they picked out bouquets. Older patrons carefully selected long-stemmed blooms for their longtime sweethearts. Marion worked tirelessly through the day, mind abuzz with orders. On Valentine's Eve, as the town's lights grew dim and lovers retreated to candlelit dinners, Marion stayed behind in her shop to finish arrangements. A sudden power outage plunged the space into darkness. Outside, the wind howled, carrying a misty rain. She checked her phone to find only 2% battery remaining. Frustrated but unfazed, she decided to head home, packing up a few leftover flowers to save them from the cold. Her route took her past Crestwood Cemetery. Usually she'd avoid the place after dark. Urban legend or not, the idea of walking near gravestones at night spooked her. But the alternative was a long, winding detour through poorly lit back streets. So she gathered her courage and stepped onto the cemetery path, the wrought iron gates groaning as she slipped through. Thin fog blanketed the ground, swirling around tombstones that glistened with rain. The moon cast faint silver beams, revealing a narrow path winding deeper into the old burial grounds. Marion kept her eyes straight ahead, trying to ignore the sensation that every statue and carved angel was watching her. Then she saw movement in her peripheral vision, a figure clad in a tattered white veil kneeling over a grave. A shiver coursed through Marion's body. Her mind raced. Could this be the Vanishing Valentine? She'd never believed the stories, but found her heart thumping violently in her chest. She considered turning back. Then, curiosity, perhaps foolish or brave, propelled her forward. She approached slowly, each step crunching the wet gravel beneath her feet. The figure seemed not to notice her at first. The veil clung to the woman's pale face, hiding her features in shadow. She was placing wilted roses on the grave, one by one, in a slow, methodical ritual. Something about the scene tugged at Marion's heart. It looked painfully lonely. She cleared her throat softly. Are you okay? The woman lifted her head. Even through the veil, Marion could see hollow sockets where eyes should be, an emptiness that made her step back in alarm. A chill wind stirred the veil, revealing a faint glow of moonlight on a face that wasn't quite human. With deliberate slowness, the figure reached into the bouquet on the grave and plucked a single rose, dark and withered. She held it out toward Marion. Fear clashed with compassion inside Marion. The legends roared in her mind. If you accept the flower, you'll vanish. But the woman's posture looked so anguished. A wave of pity coursed through Marion. She didn't reach out her hand, unsure of what to do. The woman waited, unmoving, rose extended in her bony grip. Finally, Marian whispered, "I'm sorry, I can't." The figure tilted its head as if puzzled by her refusal. Then, with eerie smoothness, she placed the rose on the ground between them and slowly melted into the fog, vanishing without a sound. Heart hammering, Marian scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the wet grass. When she looked again, the figure was gone. Only the single rose remained, lying in the mist. After a moment's hesitation, Marian inched forward, adrenaline pounding in her ears. The rose, once withered, now appeared fresh and red, a drop of dew glittering on its petals. Carefully, she scooped it up. So much for not accepting it, she thought, fear biting at her every nerve. That night, Marian couldn't sleep. She half expected to evaporate, to vanish into some ghostly realm the moment she dozed off. She placed the rose on her nightstand, intending to dispose of it, but some odd sense of responsibility kept her from throwing it away. When morning came, she awakened in her bed, alive and intact. Relief and confusion warred within her. Perhaps the legend wasn't real after all. Valentine's Day dawned bright, the sun piercing through last night's fog. Marian headed to her shop, rose in hand, determined to investigate the legend further. Throughout the day, she placed calls to local historians and longtime residents. Most laughed off her questions. A few older folks spoke of a tragic love story from decades past, but provided no details. Strangely, every reference pointed her to an unmarked tomb at Crestwood Cemetery, the very spot she had seen the figure. At dusk, she returned to the cemetery, rose still in her possession. She found the same grave, its inscription too faded to read. Placing the rose gently on the headstone, she murmured, "I'm sorry for your loss." A breeze rustled the skeletal branches overhead. Though the temperature remained cold, Marian felt a gentle warmth, as if she had brought some small comfort to a restless spirit. Days passed, and Marian didn't vanish. Instead, she felt an urge to keep returning to that gravestone. Each time, she brought fresh roses, placing them where she had seen the woman. She never encountered the veiled figure again, but the local rumor mill churned. People claimed to see a strange glow around that particular grave at night, or hear soft weeping near the headstone. Some speculated Marian was cursed. Others insisted she had broken the curse by refusing the offered flower. Within a month, the story of the vanishing Valentine evolved. New details spread, that the spirit no longer hunts for unsuspecting victims, having found someone who showed her compassion. Tourists began visiting Crestwood Cemetery, leaving flowers on random graves in hopes of glimpsing the legendary ghost. The local newspaper ran a piece about Marian's experience, painting her as the florist who ended the decades-old fear. Marian remained humble about the whole ordeal. She didn't claim to have banished any spirit or solved any mystery. All she knew was that the sorrow emanating from that veiled figure was real. Whenever she passed by the cemetery, she felt a bittersweet twinge. She still locked eyes with statues of angels and crucifixes in the moonlit gloom, hoping to spot a silhouette in white. But the figure never appeared to her again. The legend, however, remains alive in Rosemore. Some say that on certain foggy Valentine's nights, you can still see a veiled woman drifting between the graves, searching for a kind soul to share her grief. And perhaps if you find her, you'll be given a choice, to accept a cursed rose or to leave it behind. As for Marian, she continues to tend her flower shop, greeting each February with renewed hope that acts of compassion might lift the veil of sorrow, even for those spirits trapped between this world and the next.